What's up, everybody? Welcome back to the Traditional Press. Thanks for popping on here. Love having you all joining us on this fun and interesting adventure that we always seem to have on the Traditional Press. Today we're going to be talking about renting and why renting is not exactly ideal. Stay tuned and let's get started. According to the National Census Bureau, about 36% of the nation's 122.8 million households, about 36% of those people, those families, are currently renting, which equals to about 44 million people. And that's an extraordinary number, really, when you start thinking about just how many people currently today are renting. And renting is kind of taken for granted in this country. Everybody rents, usually what happens is you graduate from high school, you're 18, you maybe go off to college, and then you've got to live somewhere. And if you're not going to be living in a dorm, you're going to be renting an apartment. At some point in your college experience, typically you're going to go and you're going to get yourself an apartment. Although today, a lot of us are getting apartments later and later and later, and the reason for that is very simple. It's just because rents are stupid, crazy expensive. In the time that I've been out on my own, out from underneath my parents' umbrella, rents have gone up by probably 100%. They're probably double what they were when I started renting. It wasn't that hard to find a 2-bedroom apartment for about $500 a month, sometimes even a little bit less if you wanted to live in a little bit more of a janky neighborhood, but that's not going to happen anymore. If you want a 2-bedroom apartment, you're looking probably closer to $1,000 a month, maybe $1,200 a month, depending on how nice it's going to be, depending on your area. I even talked to somebody the other day who they just wanted a 2-bedroom apartment, just a 2-bedroom apartment in a decent location, and they were looking at $1,700 a month in order to pull that off. And it's like, are you kidding me right now? Like, that's more than my mortgage. And because of that, most people just simply cannot afford to go out and have apartments. And so a lot of times people are living at home more often. And, this is pretty well known and we understand this. Inflation kind of stinks and it's hurting everybody. And I just read this morning that like 122 banks are on the verge of financial collapse in this country. So these inflationary policies are working out really well for all of us. All that money in the bank, it's probably going to disappear. It's happened before. It can happen again. Trust me. Being federally insured only goes so far. And yes, banks can lose their money, your money, and all of it. And primarily what happens actually is the investors will go down, and that's just going to cause the price of everything to go up times a gazillion, because that's what happens. But as it relates to renting, typically what's happening nowadays is maybe you're 25 and you finally got a job, a decent job. You've had one for a while, you graduated college, you have gazillions of dollars in student loans, but you're 25, you're 30, however old you are, and you get your first apartment and you move out and that's where you live. And typically the way that it works in this country, or has worked for a long time, is when you're a young person, you go out and you rent an apartment. Sometimes you'll share that apartment with a couple of roomies in order to help with that ridiculously high cost of living that we're all suffering under anymore. And from there, you slowly save up enough money. You get married usually, or you get a long-term, girlfriend or boyfriend, and you guys eventually move in together, and then you start splitting the costs of your apartment, and eventually you save up enough to buy your first little house, and then you move on from that little house once you have your little wee ones, your little kids running around, because your house is too small, and so you buy a bigger house, and then you're really established in your 50s or whatever, so you sell that house and you go and you buy a really nice house, and then your kids are all gone and graduated, and now you're rattling around in this enormous house that's really nice, and you're like, this is way too big, it's way too expensive to keep up, the mortgage is crazy and all these other things. And so you sell that house and you downsize, and then you eventually end up in a retirement home. So, this plan in our American dream is not really to buy a house, which, typically people talk about the American dream from the perspective of owning your own home. That's not really true. The American dream really is retirement. Really, that's what the Americans are wanting. Us Americans are wanting. And the house, it's a part of that process. Usually it's a part of how we think about our retirement and all these kinds of things. But I want to talk about this time period of living in an apartment. And a lot of times, like if you live in a city or something like that, the whole purchasing a house thing, that's not even on the table. You're going to live in an apartment for the rest of your life. And the reason for that is simply shortage of housing. And so what we have to deal with basically is long-term renting, because it might take you 10 years either to get enough money in order to get a down payment for a decent house. 20 grand in the bank is a lot of money, and it don't buy you very much house. And, so a lot of us are going to be living in rent situations, and that's terrible for us. We shouldn't be living in apartments where we're renting to landlords that don't care about us and don't care about our property any more than it means a paycheck to them. That's the totality of the relationship between renter and landlord. And we all know, and and I know, and I've rented many a time. I've rented a house, I've rented apartments, multiple apartments. I've rented, a special little housing for, attendees at college, which was still apartment, but it was subsidized by the school. And, that was a sweet gig, and couldn't stay there forever, because once you graduate, that's pretty much the end of that. When my wife was finishing up her degree in Chicago. And we know, I know, we all know that if you don't own the apartment, you just don't really care about it as much. And the other thing that you don't think about a lot of times is you're not really willing to put in upgrades. You're not really willing to fix it up. I've never been in an apartment that has brand new countertops. And if you want a luxury like that, you're going to be paying just a ridiculous amount of money in order to get updated appliances inside of your apartment. They exist, but they're extremely rare. And, or at least in the states that I've lived, they're extremely rare. The appliances are all, ridiculously old. They're crummy. The cabinets are usually cheap. There's hardly anything going on in there. Maybe you can get the carpet replaced when you move in. Maybe. A lot of times that doesn't even happen. My brother just got an apartment and they didn't replace the carpets for him. And it's like, this used to be even standard practice. And now you're not doing even like the bare minimum of replacing carpets. Like that used to be the thing that people do. Like you get a new tenant. Okay, time to replace the carpets, maybe paint the walls. Now, forget it. There's a million patched holes in the walls, and you don't put up, new fixtures. You don't replace outlets. You don't update anything, because as a tenant, you're like, why would I spend money upgrading this thing, fixing things up, making them look really nice? Maybe like, that jet stream tub that you've always wanted that's a little bit more of a high-end finish. You're never going to put in something like that because it's not yours. Why would you waste your money on that? Probably not even allowed to do that in your lease. Your landlord's probably going to be scared stiff of you destroying his property because you don't know how to renovate things, which happens a lot too. And that also leads into the other part of this discussion, which the reality is most of us don't know how to fix anything, because if you don't own anything, you don't know how to fix it. You don't learn how to fix it. The school of hard knocks never even applies, because the reality is if something breaks, you're going to call the landlady and they're going to come out and send out a little team a week later, however long later, and eventually fix it. Whereas if something breaks in a piece of property that you own, you are the one who is responsible for fixing that. And it may be that you have to call in a plumber. You may have to call in an electrician or heating cooling guy or whatever. But a lot of times you'll look at a job and you'll be like, man, this doorknob has been sticking and sticking and sticking. It's just not really working. Do I really want to spend $200 to pay somebody to fix this? Let me watch a YouTube video, get out some of my little tools, maybe buy a new tool for my tool cabinet, which my children will inherit, and be able to fix this project myself, learn something, maybe get really frustrated, grow a bit as a person, and do all of those things which are so helpful and healthy and great for us. Maybe some of that will happen, but that can't ever happen if you're a renter in an apartment, because it's not yours. You're not even allowed to work on it. Let alone, why would you put any money or effort into it? Because you're considering your rents as covering that, and they should be. So in that area as well, renting is not as good for us. The other thing that happens, though, is the landlords don't upgrade anything in these apartments at all. They have super outdated windows. They're very inefficient for heating and cooling. They're not replacing, squeaky hinges. They're not oiling things. They're not updating. They're not maintaining. They're trying to do everything as cheaply as possible, because the reality is, when you're renting, it's a fantastic investment unless you're putting a lot of money into it. I talked to some landlords that owned a big apartment complex, and they said, there was a lot of theft in our building and we were dealing with a lot of issues, so we were looking into installing cameras, but it was going to cost $17,000 to put in this camera system all over this big apartment complex. And we were like, you know what, it's just not worth it to us. And so the renters just had to put up with more theft, because it just wasn't worth it to the landlords to install this system. They're like, we don't think we can raise rents enough to cover this $17,000 camera and security system. And I think we think that our tenants would prefer to keep their rents lower than to have the safety and security of the camera system installed. And those kinds of decisions are made all the time. And typically the landlords will always err on the side of not fixing things, not upgrading, not taking care of things. Yeah, they'll take care of the roofs, because if the roofs don't get maintained, usually the value of the apartment will be heavily damaged and they'll have a lot more expenses. So typically they'll take care of the roof and they'll cut the grass. And, that's basically the totality of what they want to have to fix. If anything that breaks in the apartment is an expense for them. If a stove goes, they are looking to replace it with the cheapest functional model that they possibly can, if it cannot be repaired. And so they have these really crummy, appliances put into these places. And, if that property was owned by an individual homeowner, they would have replaced it with something really nice, really functional, and really great, and upgraded it all on their own. But because they don't own it and the landlord doesn't own it, 30 years goes by and they're still using the same dad-blasted appliances, just cobbled together with duct tape and hopes and prayers, and they don't work quite right, and they're not very good quality. And it's kind of like living in, an Eastern European pre-communist or post-communist country, where everything's all old and outdated and the economy's all shot because of communism. And it's like, why have we done this to ourselves? Like, isn't this America? Like, we can afford a new stove. We can afford it. Why is nobody putting one in? And it's just money. And that's an example of why the relationship between landlord and renters are bad for the economy. It's bad for ourselves as individuals, as in our quest to be human. We're always trying to become more and more natural and more fulfilled. And part of that is making the place that we live nicer, upgrading things, decorating, doing, little things around our houses. And that just is not going to happen. And it cannot happen because of the nature of the relationship, which is why I am going to argue that all landlord-renter relationships in residential homes, not necessarily commercial at all, it's a whole different discussion, need to end. And the way that I would like to see that happen is something like this. And you can tell me if you think that this isn't the best plan. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments about how you could implement something like this. But I can imagine a bill or an ordinance passing that says something to the nature of, okay, landlords, you spent a ton of money buying this property. It's an investment. You deserve to get something out of this investment that you put in. Maybe you just bought an apartment. We're not just going to take it away from you. That's ridiculous. That's preposterous. And it's just not fair. It's not just. So what we're going to do is, most mortgages are 30-year mortgages. So over this next period of time, your rents are going to go toward, or the rents of the individuals that are renting are going to go towards a lease to own, as opposed to a lease to lease to lease to lease to lease forever. And you're going to get the price and the value of your property back. Maybe we'll subsidize it or something, because it's worth it to take care of 44 million people. And we're going to get out of this crazy situation where you are staying somewhere that you can't own, that you can't love, that you can't put down roots. I have family that has stayed in the same apartment for over a decade, and they love their apartment. And if they had the opportunity, they'd buy it in a heartbeat. And then what you would have is a bunch of renters turned into homeowners. And these people would then have to have like an association, an apartment association, like an HOA type of deal, in order to take care of, stuff like the roof and maintaining snow and cutting the grass and all this other kind of stuff that's, basic. And they'd have to have like a little election and have a little president and a little board and, all that kind of stuff, like every other condo or homeowners association in the world does today. And I've actually been to, and I've done work for my father's landscaping company on apartments that have done this, that have done the whole rent to own thing, and they take care of it beautifully. There's some of them in Detroit, there's some of them in other places, other cities that I've been to. They're homeowners associations. They used to be little apartments, and now they're owned by the individual tenants. And sometimes it happens with townhouses and other things like that, where you own it and you basically, have an HOA fee or whatever, which is always going to be significantly lower, because you as the tenants get to vote on that kind of stuff. And it's going to be cheaper than having a landlord over top of you, which is going to charge you the money that he needs in order to cover all the fees associated with the place, and and a surplus on top of that in order to make a profit. So all of your rents would go down already, and you would own your own property. And so the first place that you would ever buy, you might have to save up, instead of 20 grand to buy a particular property, you might only have to save up 5 grand in order to get a down payment to buy an apartment. And, some people are like, 5 grand, I could never save that up. You know what? Most security deposits today are like over $2,000. So it's not that hard. Yes, it's a little bit more of a barrier in order to get in there. And let's be honest, most states already have programs in place to be able to help subsidize you in order to get your first down payment. Like Michigan has a thing where they'll pay, I forget exactly what the percentage is, but if you're a first-time home buyer, they'll help you out a ton with your down payment, and basically you just have to pay it back as you're paying back your loan. So your loan is up a little bit higher for the first, I think it's like 10 years or something like that. And then you pay back all of the money that the state gave you in order to help you get your down payment. So the whole down payment issue, it's not really a thing. Like, it's not going to be a hurdle. There's so many easy ways in order to be able to get past that. But a $5,000 down payment is so much easier to get than a $20,000, $25,000, $30,000 down payment. And, when the emergencies come and all these things happen that happen to us, especially when we're young and we don't have very good jobs and we're not making the income that we would really like to make, the emergency comes, the car breaks down, you break your leg or whatever, some medical emergency that takes all your funds away. Well, it's a lot easier to get to that $5,000 mark and get yourself into a house before something goes wrong. Whereas when you're trying to save up $20,000, $30,000, it's a lot easier to just simply say, forget it. I've got all these expenses. I'm just gonna spend more than I would spend normally, because you know what? I've got 10 years that I've got to have to save in order to get to that mark. Whereas with the $5,000, you're more like, I can make this in a few years, 1 or 2, 3, however many years, in order to get to that point. So it's going to be a lot easier to get your down payment, and it's going to be a lot better for you. So, the idea that we have to have apartments which are owned by somebody else is simply ridiculous. It doesn't need to happen. It's not healthy for us. It's not a thing that helps that helps us be happy. When we're always, under the thumb of somebody else, we despise ourselves and that which we own. It's the same thing. It's like perception of value. If, I was talking to my wife the other day, she was telling me about a food bank and a clothing bank, this whole like charity thing that they were running in Chicago, where they were just giving everything away and nobody would come. Nobody wanted anything to do with it. So then they started charging $1 an item, regardless of whatever it was, and people just started flocking to this charity because of that perception of value. If you don't feel like you have a responsibility to the thing that you are doing, you don't care about it. You don't want it. It makes you feel like garbage anyways, knowing that you don't own your own home. And then, of course, we have to talk about property taxes as well, because I also think, I mean, it's obvious, a property tax is just a rent. You're paying rent on whatever property you are in forever. And the reason we know it's rent is because if you don't pay your property tax, somebody takes your house away. That's how renting works. You get evicted. And I think that relationship of evictions and the man, whoever the man may be, whether it's that corporation that owns your apartment building or whether or not it's the big man, the big G man, it's the same relationship. So you're running into the same problems, and we can deal with these problems and overcome them as well. So we don't need property taxes. Obviously, something like a flat tax is going to be far more fair, but the whole system of taxation is not the scope of this video, is not within the scope of this video, so we're not going to talk about that. The only thing that is really important is to talk about property taxes, which are illegal and immoral, because you should never have to worry about, if you're a free person and you want to say that you're a homeowner, you should never have to have the worry of your home being just taken away from you because you didn't pay your rents. If that's the case, then you do not own your own home. There's not one single homeowner in the United States of America. Not one single homeowner in this country, except for politicians, perhaps, who will never have to pay a lick of property tax because of some crazy law that they've written. Okay, fine. There's always going to be some oligarch who's managed to overcome this particular difficulty. But if we can eliminate the renter relationship, so I have a friend who, he has worked for himself. He's got his own business now, but he used to work for other people. He owns his own home now, but he used to rent. He used to not own his own car, but now he owns it. Now he doesn't make payments. And I've asked him, I was like, well, do you think that you took care of your things better when you didn't own them? Or do you think that you try harder and you take better care of your stuff now that you own it? And it was a clear and resounding yes. Of course I'm going to take care of my stuff more now that I own it rather than when I was renting it. And it's just a nature thing. And so we're going to do a better job taking care of our environment, specifically our housing environment that I'm talking about, if we actually own it, because this is what is natural to the human state. And of course, the great objection to this argument that I'm putting forth is the many and varied examples of when they have tried to implement this and it failed. And, I was talking to my dad about this the other day, and he brought up this particular housing association thing that they started in Detroit, where it was an apartment building. The government built these buildings, and they gave them all to these tenants, and it was like a welfare thing, and they owned it. And naturally, they destroyed it. And so the great argument is, well, just because you own your own thing doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to take care of it. And that's true in some instances, but you can't really apply the Detroit lens to other places, because Detroit, especially when that happened, was extremely corrupt, and the drugs and the violence and the gang issues is terrible. Plus, they've had decades upon decades upon decades of social programs taking care of them. And if you just, here, it's yours now. You don't have to pay for it. You don't have to work for it. Nothing. It's just yours. It's the whole perception of value thing. They haven't had to work for it. It's cheap as free. It doesn't mean anything. Whereas under my system that I think will work out, if you have to continue to pay rent for 30 years or whatever, but at the end of that time period, you own that property. And if you need to leave in the middle of that 30-year period, it will be like you have purchased into that, and so you'll be able to get some of your equity back out. How you would do that exactly is a little bit complicated, but basically you can have your landlords taking this rents and putting it towards the mortgage of the property. And just like you would have equity in your mortgage, you can buy yourself out, but you'd have to split it with the landlord that owns the property now. So it wouldn't be as nice until that 30-year period is over. And then after that period, then you will own it free and in the clear. And so it will be kind of a transitionary period where it's not quite like you own it, because the landlord will be operating like your bank. And of course, you'd have to have laws in place in order to keep them from, screwing over the renters and all that kind of stuff. But if they sell it, they won't be able to then restart their 30-year period. And it's going to be like, no, this is the 30-year period. And after this point, somebody is going to own this. And that somebody needs to be the tenants. And if you sell your apartment and a new renter comes in and takes over your apartment, they're going to take over your bills, and they're going to take over that rent relationship, and then they're going to own it if you sell. And so they're going to have to pay you the value of however much you've already paid into it. So like, for example, if you've paid 10 years out of this 30-year period, you've paid 30% of the value of this. And so if somebody buys into that, they're going to have to get a loan for 10%. Say your apartment is worth, let's make it easy math. Hopefully it won't be that like this exact, but say your apartment is worth $10,000 total, and you've paid into it for 10 years. Well, now you've paid off $3,000 of your apartment, but you have to leave, you have to sell. And so you sell out, and your, the mortgage then would be held by the bank. A new tenant moves in. Well, that new tenant would now have to generate enough funds from, he'd have to get a mortgage from a bank for the value of that $10,000 that he's already paid, or that you've already paid as the tenant that's leaving. And so you'd have to get a loan for 10 grand, or excuse me, 3 grand. I'll get my math right. You'd have to get a loan for 3 grand, which is very doable. You get your loan for 3 grand, then you can move into the apartment. Now that apartment you're leasing to own still. So you're going to deal with your landlord. The landlord is going to get that money, and the tenant that's leaving will get the $3,000 that they put into it in that time period. And you, as the new tenant, will move in. You have the equity of 3 grand. So you have basically 10 years worth of equity that you've paid off simply by moving into this, which, 3 grand and all that kind of stuff would be sort of like, your security deposit today. Anyways, so once you've paid off that 30 grand or that 3 grand, I will get my numbers right. I promise. I keep adding zeros, taking away zeros, switching it all up, but I know what's going on up here. So let's see if I can convey it out this way. But once you've paid off that 3 grand, that money is now your equity. And if you were to ever sell, you would get that money back. And then the new tenant would come in and do the exact same thing. And so at the end of that 30-year period, or however long, like the exact numbers, like 50 years, 10 years, whatever, probably 30 years. But at the end of that 30-year period, you will get, now own that little apartment free and clear. And so you have a $10,000 equity in your own apartment. You own it. It's yours. And you can sell it. You can do whatever you need to with your own money. And then, of course, there'll have to be laws in place in order to make sure that, no more renting is legal anymore. Maybe you can sublease, rooms and stuff like this, but you still have to be the primary occupant or whatever it is that you need to do. And then we can, by doing this simple plan, we can end the renter relationship, and we can begin to foster instead the true American ideals of, stick-to-itiveness, of taking care of things yourself, self-reliance, and all of these, strength-building, pioneering type impulses that we have can have a place to take form, to take flight. You can renovate your apartment if you have the money or the know-how in order to be able to do that. You can upgrade. You can start to actually take care of and fix up The apartment, once it starts to get a little bit shabby, you and your a board can vote to maybe put all new siding on the apartment complex that you're in order to make it look a lot nicer, and then it's less of an eyesore, and you're gonna be able to take care of this kind of stuff. And if we can do a little bit of something about inflation, maybe we'll have enough money in order to pull that off. But what that will do is it will generate way more income to the economy as a whole, because the landlords aren't spending that money on real things for the purposes of the apartments. That's real grassroots stuff. If instead you have individuals going down to Home Depot to buy a new lighting fixture for their apartment, suddenly you're going to see a lot more small local purchases, which is going to generate that whole reintegration into a more traditional society where it's more grassroots, because 44 million people going and taking care of their apartments, that's a big deal. Like, that's a lot of people going ahead and doing that. And so with this plan, I think, you can tell me if I'm wrong, please do comment below. I'd love to hear your opinions and thoughts on the matter. Anyway, that's all we've got for today. Thanks for listening to The Traditional Press. Love having every single one of you amazing people on here. If you could, please like and subscribe to this channel. We love having you on here. Stay strong out there, and I'll catch you all next time.
This has been the Traditional Press Podcast. Thank you for listening, and tune in next time for more traditional ideas and exploration of the why behind the what.